Hello, and welcome to Introduction to Major Western Religions. In this first video lecture, we are going to be talking a little bit about, um, we're going to be thinking a little bit about defining some terms, defining things like religion, defining a little bit about God, and then also part of the purpose of this video really just is to get you thinking, about religion and some about your concepts, but not just your concepts, but also concepts of other people as well, and trying to glean from other people's ideas or even other religions that you don't adhere to if you adhere to any religions. Um, trying to think about those things, trying to come to not really to gain a lot of knowledge at this point, but to just get the wheels turning on what religion is, what God might be, and how that might play into the lives of humans, and in this case also including yourself. And so in this case, just with the title introduction, my notes are over here to my right, that's why I'll be looking over here quite a bit. Just in that title, Introduction to Major Western Religions, what exactly do we mean by major Western religions? And in this case, we just mean the ones that are um, on the western side of the map. If you lay a flat map out there in front of yourself, you're talking mostly about some of the Middle East, Europe, and the Americas. And the three major religions in the western part of the world are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I put them in that order, and I'll keep them in that order because that's the order in which they were founded. So those three religions are the big ones in the West. There are other religions that exist in the West and that are adhered to and were even born in the West, but those are the three big ones that play a large role in our world today, and they're the ones that we're going to be focused on. Other stuff will kind of come up a little bit. I'll use an example, or I'll say, here's an idea or a thought or whatever. But mostly what we're talking about here are going to be those three religions. So, having said that, what is it that we mean when we use the word religion? So, just trying to get the wheels turning, as I said before, trying to get those wheels turning. What exactly do we mean when we say the word religion? And lots of different ideas come to different people's heads. It kind of depends on your approach. What do I mean? It depends somewhat on your approach. Well, if you're a scholar, if you're someone who's studying religion, the approach that we're going to be taking in this class is probably one that will look quite different than most of you are familiar with, unless you have gone out and endeavored to understand religion from a scholastic point of view. This is going to be kind of new and different for you. And so, if we're approaching it like we are in this class, that's going to look very different than, say, for example, um, approaching religion from a practitioner's perspective, someone who believes in a particular religion and is seeking to carry it out. So for us, it's going to be something more bookish, more scholarly than other particular approaches. And there are other approaches that you can take as well. There's a historical approach if you're just studying religion purely for the to try to understand how it has impacted history. That's going to affect the way you look at the different religions as opposed to, say, the scholastic or the practitioner perspective. Also, there is an archaeological perspective on religion. If you're digging up certain um, sites, different temple sites, which is what we see happening quite a bit in the world. If you look at perhaps Stonehenge, perhaps that was a temple site. We see several temple sites in South America that are being excavated that are certainly something to do with religion. We also see in the dig site in Göbekli Tepe that that one is also a dig site that is investigating perhaps something to do with their religious understanding. And if you approach it from an archaeological perspective, you're going to see things very differently. And then there's also culture. How does religion affect culture? And then there's also theological, meaning trying to study God. Theo in Greek just means God. Theo, Theo means God. And so if you're approaching it from the study of trying to study who God might be, well, then your perspective is going to be very different as well. So think of it this way: if you put on certain colored glasses, they're going to tint the world to seem to be the color of the lenses of the glasses. So if I put on glasses that are just dark sunglasses, it's going to shade the world into a darkness. But if I put on lenses that are pink, that are pinkish, then I could see the world with kind of a pinkish hue, or I might see the world if I have green ones on through a green kind of hue. And the world is going to look different depending on the glasses that you put on. So all of those different ways of studying religion, those are different kinds of glasses that you can put on. All of them are useful, but certainly, if you're going to be completely comprehensive, you'll need to mix and match them some as well. You can't just do one and then decide, I have a firm understanding of religion. You're going to need to do multiple of them. Okay, so what is religion? It's a little bit tricky. As we're looking at religion, one of the things that we ask is, what is religion, as we've been talking about? And then the second thing here, since we're talking about major world religions, is what do we mean by well, backing up. I was about to say world religion, but now backing up just a second. What is it? How do we define religion? I've already said it kind of depends on the glasses colored. So we need kind of a basic working definition in this class. And here's the one we're going to use. It might not be yours. You might have a different definition, but this is the one that I'm basically going to have in my head. And so I'll put it in yours, and then we'll use it in this class. Religion can be defined as a way of life organized around experiences and convictions concerning ultimate power. And what do we mean by organized way of life? Well, it's a way of life that we structure ourselves in such a way to adhere to perhaps the religion that we have accepted. Or perhaps to deny all religions, or to deny certain religions that we have rejected even. But it's something that organizes and structures. And here's what we mean. If you are Christian, and I imagine most of you are, because I live in a Christian culture, and so I imagine most of you probably are, think about, if you know Christians, or if you are a Christian, think about how Christians organize their lives. They structure their lives in such a way so that religion is incorporated. It's part of their life. It has meaningful input. It's not just something that they are once or twice a year, perhaps, but it's something that is perhaps daily or weekly or even monthly, if they're not quite as dedicated as some other followers. And so, looking at it that way, you actually have meaning and purpose, and it affects the way you live your life and the way that you think. So that's what we mean by it's an organized way of life, and it is based around experiences and convictions. Um, there are lots of different religious experiences that people have. Not going to go on into that. That's not part of the purpose of this course, but people do have those religious experiences. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of this lecture. But people with those religious experiences, or even just convictions, hey, I think this is what God wants me to do with my life, and then you structure yourself in order to try to achieve that thing that you think God wants you to accomplish with your life. So that's what we mean by structure, and then experiences and convictions. And then ultimate power, what we mean there really just is a deity of some sort, whatever that deity might be. Now, in this course, that deity is going to be uh, labeled mostly, I'm just going to say God. And I mean God in this case, as in God with a big G. Big G meaning that it's a proper name, right? So other religions don't, when they use the word God, they don't necessarily mean a proper name of God. So, for example, in the Egyptian religion, Anubis is one of the gods, but that's a small g god. Not an insult to Anubis. His name, Anubis, gets capitalized. But in this case, with these three major Western religions that we're going to be addressing, God is a proper name for these individuals. And so you capitalize it in that case. When you're talking about the god Anubis, you don't capitalize the G in God, because that's not Anubis's proper name. But in this case, with these three, it is going to be a proper name, and so you'll see that capitalized sometimes. And that's why, because it's the proper name in this case. So that ultimate power being God. Now, let me back up kind of quickly here and say, too, I would imagine that I'll have some students who don't believe in God, and that's perfectly fine. Looking at this as we're going through the course is to study these major world religions. In this course, the objective is not to try to prove the existence or non-existence of a deity. Rather, it is to look at the understanding that these three particular religions have of the deity that they believe that does in fact exist. Now, there's other places where those arguments belong. I teach philosophy courses, and I have those kinds of discussions, those types of arguments in my philosophy course, but this is not the place where that particular argument is going to take place. That's not what this class is for. This class is to look at the three and try to understand them. And understanding is the beginning. If you disagree with something that you don't understand, you, well, I'm not sure that you really necessarily fully grasp what it is that you're disagreeing with. Like, if you don't understand something, then how can you be sure that you don't agree with it? You have to understand something before you can know if you agree or disagree. And so understanding is the first step. That's going to be our goal in this class, understanding these three a little bit better by the end of it. That's what we're after. So not trying to prove any of these religions is right or wrong or good or bad, none of that. Just understand them, move on. That's the purpose of this course. If you want to take it further in your own life and in your own studies, that's great. And I can point you towards some resources where they have the argument for the existence of God, or which religion might be true. All those things are fine and good, but that's not the place of this class. So, all right, moving into the next piece. We've talked about what is a religion. We've talked a little bit about what does it mean. We're moving into what does it mean for something to be a world religion. This one's a lot easier. If something's a world religion, it has worldwide reaching influence, and in that it crosses local, ethnic, and national boundaries. Now, what's the opposite of that? What's a religion that's not a world religion? We see some examples here, especially coming from the Native Americans that were here in America before the Europeans came. A lot of the religious concepts in that area of the world were tribal. They were local. They didn't go beyond this particular group of individuals who lived in this particular area of what's now the United States. We still see this with some type of local religions with some tribes, say, like in South America or deeper in the bush of Africa or the Aborigines in Australia. Some of their religions are more animistic, meaning that they worship animals or spirit animals or whatever. And so you see those kinds of local, they're contained in a small area, but they don't reach beyond, say, in this case, especially I'm thinking of the Aborigines, that it doesn't reach beyond that ethnic boundary. It certainly doesn't reach beyond a local boundary, and it certainly doesn't reach out into the globe, into the national boundary of the world. So by world religion, we mean something that crosses these particular lines and has influence on a larger scale. And so with these three religions, we certainly see Jews, Christians, and Muslims in multiple countries worldwide, and so it's termed as a world religion. That's what that means. Okay. Yes, and there are some religions that have reached the status of world religion and then they lost it. They died out or slowed down. Thinking of Zoroastrianism, for example, here, that is still with us, it's still around, but and it does reach more people around the globe today than it did even 100 years ago. But in this case, Zoroastrianism at one point was a world religion, and now it has decreased in its influence, but is making somewhat of a comeback as well. Okay. All right. So that's what we mean by religion and what we mean by world religion. Now, what is it that we mean in this case by the word God? And as I already said, God in this case is a big G God. That's what these three are talking about. It's a proper name. And studying God and like trying to understand and define God a little bit is very important, especially when it comes to these religions, these monotheistic religions. Now, what does it mean to be a monotheistic religion? Mono just means one, and then theism, again, theo in Greek is God. So it is one Godism. So they believe that there's only one God in this case. So trying to understand um, who God might be, thinking about your own concept of God. If I were standing in a classroom at this point, I would look at my students and I would say, all right, I'm going to say the word God. Now you tell me, what is it that comes in your mind? What's the first mental picture or the first word or the first anything? Just what jumps into your mind when I say the word God? And usually I'll get a variety of answers, anything from love or creator or most of the time most people are thinking and don't want to say it in an academic setting. They're thinking some old guy with a beard sitting on a cloud looking down toward earth. That's what a lot of people see when you use the word God. Okay. But what is God's most basic attributes is something I want to address kind of quickly. Again, this is not meant to be a detailed teaching lecture. I'm not trying to, give you information and knowledge. I just want to get the wheels turning. I just want your mind to start thinking through different issues. So when we start talking about God and we're saying, what's God's most basic attributes? Meaning, what is God like, or what does God do? What's God capable of? How should I think about and understand this particular being? Okay, so one of the most talked about attributes of God is what's called God's omnipotence. Now, what does that mean? Omni just means all, and then um, potence means to have power, and so He's omni, all powerful in that case, right? So, is God really all powerful is a question that I get from students quite a bit. So I kind of open some of the thinking about God with this particular topic, right? Trying to figure out who God is, what God might be capable of, just what is it that God can do. So, can God do anything? Uh, if God can do anything, then can God create, for example, a stone so heavy that he can't lift it? Now, think about it for just a moment. If God can't create a stone so heavy that he can't lift it, meaning that it wouldn't matter how big the stone was, he could lift it no matter how large it was, then there's something God can't do. God can't create a stone that's so heavy that he can't lift it, so God's not all powerful. On the other hand, if God can create a stone so heavy that he can't lift it, then there's something God can't do, namely lift the stone. He created a stone that was so large that he was unable to move it. So, either way, there would be something that God can't do. Or another example I get quite often, another question along the same lines: can God create a square circle? And if you think about the definition of a square and you think about the definition of a circle, a square, I'm just going to say this is not precise, but let's just say, has no sides and no corners. That's a circle. A square on the other hand has four equal sides and four 90-degree angle corners. That's rough. Okay. So, can God create a geometric shape that is literally a square circle? And the answer seems to be no. And so, there you have something else that God can't do. Can God exist and not exist at the same time? And if the answer is no, well, then there's something God can't do. And so, sometimes these examples are used to show that God's not all powerful. I will say that two of those questions, I think they have good answers that are basically pretty simple and easy to grasp. If God is in fact all powerful, meaning there's no limit to what he can do, his power is infinite, then the question of the um, the stone so heavy that he can't lift it seems to be a bit of a contradiction. And here's what I mean. Imagine that I've got a chalkboard, a dry erase board here with me behind me, and I draw that line that represents infinity. So a line, and then on both ends, I put an arrow, right? You can draw that on a piece of paper. Hopefully, you remember that from some math class that you took however long ago. And so that line represents the concept of infinity. Now, if I drew another line that was longer and put arrows on both ends, it's also a line that represents infinity, but one line is, let's say, 3 inches long and the other is 6 inches long. Now, which of those two lines is longer in what it's representing? And the answer is they're equal. It doesn't matter how long, whether it's 3 or 6 inches, the line is representing infinity, and you can't have one thing that is infinite that is more infinite than another thing. So you can't have one infinity out infinitying another infinity, right? So that's kind of a way of understanding with God and the rocks are large, they can't lift it. If God if God's power to move heavy objects is infinite, I always think that's kind of amusing. But if God's power to move heavy objects is infinite, then the stone would also have to be infinite. And you can't have one infinity being more infinite than the other infinity. So the question really doesn't make sense. And the next one, too, there with the square circle. Can God create a square circle? Here, I get a little bit more philosophical with my students because it's useful. I don't know that these questions are designed to be anything other than just kind of a trap, right? There is no, you know, real answer, and maybe God's power, still is infinity. We don't know what the answer probably is to these types of questions. The questions are designed to be trap questions. They're not designed to help us to understand God's attributes. They're designed to prove one thing, but just the way the questions are set up, they're kind of word magic things that are trying to disprove something. And I think that's not very useful, but I like to address them because it helps my students get started thinking about their own concept of God. And you'll see why in a minute when I tell the story. So, can God create a square circle? Um, Here, again, a little more philosophical. I want to be careful. I don't have some kind of one infinity out infinity in the other, but here I want to be careful. I like to answer my students who ask this particular question. I like to answer that particular question with a resounding yes. Uh, Perhaps God can do something that you and I cannot conceive of. We can't conceive of a square circle. Now, I don't think God really, can create a square circle. I think these two things are truths or they're different by definition. They're By definition, this is a square. By definition, this is a circle. What you're really asking God to do is, change kind of the definition of these two things in that, and then try to, make two opposite definitions, um, make them somehow the same thing. So it's kind of an impossible task. But like I said, I like to use this one instead to start people thinking, well, maybe God could create a square circle. I don't think so, but that's not the point. The point is you need to start thinking about God being able to do things that humans possibly can't conceive of. And I think that's really, really important because if you can fully conceive of God, then probably your conception of God is too small. If God really is the creator of the universe who set all of this stuff in place, then God can probably do things that you can't really even think about. And I think that's really important for humans to begin to understand. There was a mathematician by the name of Leibniz who answered this question by saying that God can do anything that's possible. So the whole stone, God existing and not existing at the same time, that's not something that's possible, but God can do anything that's possible. So if it's not possible, existing, not existing at the same time, then Leibniz would say, no, that's just silly and God can't do it. But if it is possible, then God is all powerful in that God can do anything that can, in fact, be done. Right? So Leibniz answers that question that way. And that's useful because it moves us to the next question, starting to think more on the lines of theology and less on the lines of logic and the possibilities and impossibilities. Okay, let's assume that Leibniz is correct. God can do anything that can be done. So then, can God tell a lie or break a promise? Meaning, can God do something that's evil? Is that something that God can do? So I use this example because I was standing in kind of a circle of friends, and two of these individuals were having a conversation about whether or not God can lie. Um, One arguing that God can lie, but because God's perfect, God won't do it. The other arguing that because God is perfect, God can't lie because it would be unthinkable. It would be so uncharacteristic that it would moves into the realm of impossibility. So God can't lie. And both of them were making very, very good points about whether or not God could or could not lie, or simply doesn't lie. And it was an interesting conversation. I'm kind of weird, I think. And so I found it to be an interesting conversation. In the end, I didn't make up my mind. But I think that it's important to not necessarily answer that kind of question. That's not what our class is for. It's not what we're looking at, but to start thinking about what it is that God is. Is God a creature that can't lie, or is God a creature that won't lie? And sometimes those distinctions are kind of useful and sometimes important, and then sometimes they are not useful and they're not important in our class, our particular circumstance. We're not going to be talking about those things, but I want you to start thinking about your understanding of God and also begin to think about other people's understandings. So, as I said, both sides made really, really good points. And it's important to listen to both sides in a conversation that you find meaningful. Uh, Listen to both sides, trying to understand both sides first, and then perhaps walking away, as I did in that particular case, and just saying, "I'm not sure what the right answer is." That's also acceptable. If you're simply, not sure, you can do it that way as well. But it's important to listen and try to understand first before you jump in and try to make a decision. Well, it's this. Well, let's hear what the other side has to say as well, right? Okay. All right. So, still thinking about this idea of what is it that God can and can't do, I found a story that I found very, very useful for me understanding, trying to begin to understand the power of God, or how I can begin to approach my understanding of what God might be and what God might be capable of as well. So, I tell this story to you because it was meaningful to me. All right. So, imagine that you're sitting there in your home, and I'm going to put your home just in a box. Okay, so you're sitting there in your box, and for whatever reason, the television's off, everything's quiet, which is really weird. But you're sitting there in your box and you're thinking quietly, you're contemplating something rather quietly. And then suddenly a voice speaks to you out of nothing. And you're not used to voices speaking to you out of nothing, hopefully. And so what do? Well, you freak out. So you freak out for a moment, but then the voice speaks to you again and it says, calm down. I'm a four-dimensional being, and I'm here to introduce myself to you. And so you're sitting there, and in a moment of clarity, you stop freaking out. And in a moment of clarity, you realize the correct question then is, okay, well, I'm a three-dimensional being. You're a four-dimensional being. What is it that you can do that I can't do, right? Because four-dimensional beings, if they exist, they could do something that we can't do. All right, so what is it that you can do that we can't do? And the four-dimensional being says, I can't explain it to you. Let me show you. So he whisks you away through a wormhole to a two-dimensional world. And there, sitting in that two-dimensional world, the four-dimensional being reveals to you a two-dimensional being. And that being is doing what you were doing. You were sitting in your box contemplating things quietly, but in this case, the two-dimensional being is not sitting in a box. Instead, it's sitting in just a square, right? Because two dimensions are flat. So think drawing on a piece of paper, two dimensions. That being, two-dimensional character, sitting in his box, contemplating something quietly. And so the four-dimensional being says to you, speak to him and introduce yourself. And so you speak to him, and that two-dimensional being is not used to things speaking to it out of nothing either. And so he also freaks out, but then you say to him, calm down. I'm a three-dimensional being. I'm here to introduce myself to you. And he says, well, you're a three-dimensional being. I'm a two-dimensional being. What is it that you can do that I can't do? Same question you asked with different numbers. So you look at this two-dimensional being and you say to him, okay, you can go up and down, and you can go forwards and backwards. Right? So if you're having trouble with that, think the old Mario game, right? Mario there on the TV screen could go forward and backward and up and down, and I fell off the cliff all the time. So forward and backward and up and down, right? And then you say to that being, I can move side to side. Now, can that being conceive of side to side in a world where there is only forward, backward, up, and down? That entity will have no way of grasping what side to side could possibly mean. Imagine Mario, you trying to explain to that entity who is programmed into a two-dimensional world, trying to explain to it something that is beyond its programming, right? So with Mario, Mario could never step out of the television screen or through the back of the television. It simply isn't within the parameters of its existence. So scientists at one point hypothesized that there's 10 dimensions, and I think the number went up to like 22 or something. I don't know. I like to stick with 10 because it's nice and round, it's easy. Let's say there's 10 dimensions. Okay. If God's the ultimate being and can do anything that can be done, right? Remember Leibniz. Then God can act and function in all 10 dimensions. We only function in three. Now, if that's the case, then God can act and function in seven dimensions. Not only that, we can't act and function within, but we can't even conceive of them. God might be able to do something that is so massively mysterious to us that we don't understand how that type of function could be performed. It would look godlike to a two-dimensional being. For those of us who can move side to side, it would look like a godlike power to us if we could somehow reveal to them, ourselves, and then we move side to side. That would be spectacular because it is so far beyond their programming, they probably wouldn't be able to conceive of it. And that's what we mean. That's what I mean when I'm talking about trying to be sure that your definition and understanding of God is not too small. If your conception of God is so small that you conceive of what God is, you probably need to try to expand your concept of God. So maybe God needs to be something that is much, much larger. Our understanding, our definition of God needs to be something that's much, much larger than we can understand. And that's why I said to my students, yes, God can create a square circle. Maybe God can do something in those other dimensions that we can't even conceive of. Maybe God can create square circles. I don't think so, but you see what I'm saying, I hope. But with that concept and understanding, how should we talk about God? Um, Here, what different thinkers have found, and I want to go through this kind of quickly, but what different thinkers have found is that we have to be careful with the language that we use about God. There's two extremes. One, where we use terms that are so earthly and so common and so normal that we make God look like something that's of this earth and that's common and normal here to us. So you have to use terms that are somewhat other than the common and normal and earthly stuff that we have here. And so we have to define God in those types of terms. But on the flip side of that, you want to be careful, because if you use terms that are so other than, that are so far beyond what we see and know and understand on this earth, then you run the risk of blowing your own mind, in the sense of that, how you understand God is something that you can't even begin to conceive of. And that's not useful either. And so, somewhere probably in between is a useful way of talking about and understanding God, where you understand God using some earthly, common, ordinary terms, and then on the other hand, you use some terms that perhaps are otherworldly and are much larger. And so it's useful to kind of use those two things in order to talk about and describe who God is and what God might be up to. Some people have said that in order to think about God, we should only use reason, meaning logic. I also teach logic, and in this case, what we find is that you can't logic your way to God. You can't logically understand everything that there is to understand about God. It's just not something that logic is up to the task of, right? So we found that logic comes up short. On the other hand, some people have said, and this is the opposite, right? So I'm kind of doing polar opposites here. Uh, just logic, and then other people are saying just faith. The only way to truly understand God is just through some type of faith understanding of God. I think both of those are useful, but I think faith on that particular extreme, without some type of reason, faith is unguided. It doesn't have anything to try to help steer it. Imagine a boat that doesn't have a rudder, or a plane that doesn't have a prop. You have to have something that kind of moves the boat in a direction. Otherwise, what you're going to get is people just having faith in anything for any reason, or perhaps even no reason whatsoever. In fact, that's what logic is. It's being and looking for reasons and trying to steer towards something that is sensible, almost reasonable. But it's trying to steer towards something that is not just, well, I believe this because, today I woke up and I had ham, and so I believe this to be the case, right? Or I believe this because I like it, which is the same thing as saying the ham didn't upset my stomach, and therefore, I believe it. And tomorrow maybe the ham does, and you change your mind. There's got to be some kind of way to put us on a track. Reason helps to guide and to steer, but we can't get there simply through that. And so many of the thinkers have said there's an element of both faith and reason that's involved. So again, I'm not saying which one should dominate your life. I'm just saying there's a couple good things to think about there, right? Two polar opposites. Maybe they're both useful. Maybe that's something you want to think about, in your own life. And also, you'll see those things being used as we go through this course. The different writers, the different theologians. You'll see them using faith. You'll see them using reason. Both of those particular tools within religion. All right. So we defined a little bit about religion, and we defined a little bit about God, and thought about using faith, thought about using reason. All right. So what about any kind of practical, useful anything? Is there anything that religion has to offer to different humans? And one of the things that some believers have argued that religion gives to them is some type of meaning in life, right? And so we're going to look at those two poles, right? The opposites of no meaning and then meaning within the deity and a little bit in between as well. So, can life, can you find any kind of meaning for life through a pursuit of religion? Starting first of all, kind of quickly here, is there any meaning to life that religion can offer any answers to? There are many opinions. Christians and Muslims think that life is preparation for the next life. That's kind of a crude, rough, fast, one sentence definition. It's more to it than that. It's so much more complicated than that. We'll talk about how much more complicated it is throughout the semester, and for now, I'm just trying to get your mind working, okay? So, Christians and Muslims think life is preparation for the next life. A Confucius, not a Western religion, an Eastern religion. Confucius believed that life is about being the most socially ordered person that you can be. It's a social religion. It's not really a religion like we think of religions here in the West. Hindus and Buddhists believe that you are in a cycle of lives and eventually that you'll lose the self. That self will reattach itself to God, basically. And so you're in a constant state of reincarnation, and eventually, hopefully, you'll work out your karma. And when you do that, that bit of the deity that's attached to yourself, it returns to God, something like that, right? So again, very brief, very simple explanation. But that's the meaning of life that these individuals have had. It's preparation for another life, or it's something that you use in this life in order to be socially ordered being, or you're in that cycle of life where eventually, that's the meaning of life. Eventually, you'll reattach yourself to God. Okay. Kind of the opposite of those positions is a position that's sometimes called the absurdist. Now, an absurdist looks around and says the entire universe is absurd, but more perhaps useful definition that all life and all of everything, it's just a joke. It's a great cosmic joke. All of this that's out here is one massive accident. And for some, perhaps it's a happy accident, but not so much with the absurdists. They tend to be kind of dark and melancholy. um, and they see it as being a cruel joke, something that perhaps ought not to have happened, and something that is not good. It's not pleasant. And so here, to kind of give you an idea of some of their thinking and some of their writing, here is an ancient Greek thinker named Emilio who is kind of on this term of an absurdist. Here's what he said, quote, "All life is a shadow of a smoke wreath, an empty gesture in the air, a hieroglyphic traced in the sun for an instant in the sand, and effaced a moment afterwards by a breath of wind, an air bubble expanding and vanishing on the surface of the great river of being, an appearance of vanity and nothing." I love that quote. It's very helpful for trying to help people to understand the absurdist opinion and understanding of just how ridiculous, pointless, meaningless, there's no lasting effect of any of this. So let's kind of look at this quickly, and I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on it, but looking at it kind of quickly, all of life is a shadow of a smoke wreath. Now think about how pointless and meaningless and how fleeting, meaning it doesn't last very long, and the consequences of a smoke wreath are almost nothing, right? So imagine that, here you've got a little puff of smoke and it comes up and it forms into a circle, and there it is, and then in the next instant it's gone. And what effect did that really have on anything around it? And the answer is nothing. But that's the smoke wreath itself. And so here Emilio is saying life is not like a smoke wreath. Life is like the shadow of a smoke wreath that is much, much less substantial even than the smoke wreath itself. And that's how meaningless and useless and pointless and how much impact and it's just none. It's all worthless and without any type of well-meaning. And so here, it's an empty gesture in the air. And so if I just gesture my hand like that, life is like that in that life is no more consequential than the simple movement of my hand that I just performed, and it has no more lasting or meaning or impact than that simple movement that my hand did, which is to say, none. Right? That hieroglyphic that's traced in the sun. What I like to say is imagine yourself on the beach and the ocean, is coming in, and you draw some letters or numbers there on the sand, and then the ocean erases them when the next time a wave comes in. How much meaning did those letters or numbers have? None. That's what life is like, he says. That expanding bubble. Think of there yourself on the beach, and there's little bubbles that come up out of the ocean, and they're there one moment, and they pop, and they're gone. And did they affect anything? No, they had no effect on the world around them. And he says it's a vanity, it's a nothing. It's pretty dismal, it's pretty dark, but you begin to understand and see here that from these particular persons' point of views, and these are going to be, again, absurdist. Sometimes these individuals later will be lumped into um, uh, the category of, oh, I've lost the word. I can only get one word in my head, and it's the wrong one. Existentialists. They're going to be lumped into the category of an existentialist. And existentialists are formed up mostly with Kierkegaard, but I'm sorry, with Nietzsche. But there are those who were writing about the same ideas way before Nietzsche existed. But in this case, most of the time, these individuals, these existentialists and the absurdists, they're going to be atheists. They're going to be people who say there is no God, there's nothing out there, it's just the universe, it's all a cruel joke, it's all an accident. Nothing brought this about on purpose, and there is no meaning, and there is no hope, and there is no purpose, and there is no nothing. There is just this one life that we have here, and then once it's over, everything is gone. And so, there with those absurdists, um, and you can see that meaninglessness and that pointlessness. Some have said that religion does offer meaning and hope and purpose in a world which has been had it removed by these individuals who believe that there's no such thing. Now, I mentioned Nietzsche. Some existentialists do think that there is some hope or purpose or meaning in life that is apart from religion. And I want to give you a few things in here again. I'm trying to get those wheels turning. Is it true that there is no hope or meaning or purpose without some type of deity? Or can there be other things that perhaps could engage humanity that would allow that there is hope, meaning, and purpose, right? So with Nietzsche said that any meaning is better than no meaning. So maybe the universe, he's thinking, maybe it is without meaning. Maybe it's without hope and purpose and all of those different things. But it's better to have some kind of meaning. It's better to live for some type of meaning than to live for no type of meaning. So he said that perhaps humanity could find meaning within the noble values or within great artistic achievements. And so there with great artistic achievements, pretty obvious what he's going to say. You create something beautiful like music that perhaps moves or speaks to an audience that perhaps that's something that is meaningful and purposeful and useful and might even last. One of my favorite bands, groups, artists is the band Queen, and Freddie Mercury I think was a philosopher who expressed himself very, very well through music. And you find his music in a lot of different weird kind of ways. I think Mercury was a very interesting character. That one song, This Thing Called Love, I probably heard that 20 times before I knew it was Freddie Mercury because it is so unlike him. That music is so unlike him. Say, when you compare it to something like Bohemian Rhapsody, which is deep and brooding and brilliant and awful and moving and passionate and all of these things, right? But if you study it pretty closely, you'll find that it has that kind of absurdist mentality. If you've heard the song before, Bohemian Rhapsody, just kind of quickly, nothing really matters to me. That's absurdist. That's existential. There's no meaning, purpose, or value. Any way the wind blows, here, there, shot the guy, didn't shoot the guy, makes no difference. Any way the wind blows, it's all meaningless and purposeless. So you can see how they're, Mercury's this, um, he's teetering with, he's messing with those ideas. I'm not sure which way he particularly went in his final years, but you can see him there talking through, and he's having these thoughts about the meaning of life. And so Nietzsche said artistic achievements, music can be something that's beautiful and wonderful, and it moves me, and hopefully, and I know it moves lots of other people too, hopefully it moves you. But then also through noble values, Nietzsche said, and what he means kind of is this idea of um, trying to reach some type of, uh, oh, I'm not going to say moral greatness, because if you've ever looked at his Uberman, the Superman, then it gets a little bit different. So suffice to say that he looked at humanity and he saw in us potential for nobility, and to the degree to which we embrace that nobility, right, that ability to be something better than and great, perhaps. Uh, Maybe there's meaning and purpose in that. Something to think about. Camus, who was also an existentialist, said that he finds human meaning in a non theistic way as well in this particular case, and I think through greatly through integrity. So, in his work, Camus' work called A Man for All Seasons, he tells a story. It's of a young lawyer who was in the red light district of Amsterdam at late hour, let's just say 2 in the morning. And so at a late hour, there he is in the red light district. And this young lawyer is walking through the streets, and he hears a woman cry for help. And he starts to move towards the woman, but then he checks himself because he begins to think, what if the woman is crying for help, but she is part of a gang? And as soon as I come around the corner to assist her, they jump me and rob me and beat me to death. Or he thinks to himself, what if the woman is crying for help because she's drowning, and I jump in the water to save her, and then, in her panic, she drowns me as well? And he starts going through these different scenarios of, perhaps it's this, perhaps it's that, and maybe I shouldn't answer this cry for help. And as he's going through these different scenarios in his mind, he suddenly realized that the cry for help has ceased. The woman is no longer crying for help. And he suddenly is overcome with grief and guilt, because he has committed what's called the sin of omission, because he failed to act in a way that he thought perhaps he should have acted. And so he runs into a tavern and he begins to confess his sin of omission to the tavern keeper there. And in the work, Camus, the author, Camus judges him with this phrase. He said, "He did not answer the cry for help. That is the man he was." And I think that's very pointed. I think there's some good wisdom there within Camus. Um, Camus thinking that we are alone here on this mud ball, right? To kind of put it in the way he would term it, perhaps. Here we are, spinning in space. We're all alone. There's no God. And there are plenty of people around us who are crying for help. And we have a choice to make. We can have the integrity to answer the cry for help, or we can be like the young lawyer and we can fail to answer that cry for help. And so Camus is going to find meaning and existence, and meaning in existence and purpose in existence through this type of integrity. And he tells other stories like that as well. Interesting type of way of approaching it, but again, non-theistic. And so now kind of moving towards a theistic, right? Because I wanted to give you a few things over here in the non-theistic category to think about, and then something over here in the theistic category to think about as far as perhaps religion offering some type of meaning and purpose to life. But in order to do that, I think successfully, I needed to explain to you non-theistic thinking about meaning and purpose in life. Okay, so now theistic thinking about meaning and purpose in life. Kierkegaard, also an existentialist, but kind of weird in that he's an existentialist because most of the time they're atheist and there's no meaning and there's no purpose, and somehow Kierkegaard is an existentialist, but it's always been kind of weird to me that he's in that category, but he is. And so Kierkegaard said that in order to find that kind of meaning and purpose, that you have to take what's called a leap of faith and leap towards believing in the existence of God, even though you can't prove it. Now, here I want to be very, very careful and make sure I explain. You can neither prove nor disprove the existence of God. So far, humans have not done this, and I'm not sure they can. I'm not certain that it's something that you can necessarily just offer evidence to everyone. I understand personal experience, and we're heading in that direction, okay? So if you're thinking I've got personal experience and therefore that proves to me the existence of God, that's great. I'm not saying it doesn't. What I'm saying is that your personal experience isn't something that you can lay down that everyone has now experienced, and therefore everyone is as equally convinced in the existence of God as you are, because it's your personal experience, it's not ours. We'll talk about that again in just a minute. But just so you kind of understand where I'm headed, we can't prove it through logic or science or anything. There's good arguments for the existence of God with logic and science, and against God with logic and science, and all this stuff is useful and the things great. I find that stuff fascinating. But I know in the end, you can't prove it one way or the other. So Kierkegaard, with that understanding himself, says you have to take a leap of faith. Think of a big cliff where you're trying to get from one cliff to the other side, but there is no bridge. There's no way for you to walk across it safely. You're going to have to leap. What you have to do in a situation like that is try to find, if you're like me with limited leaping experience, abilities, limited leaping abilities, you're going to try to find the smallest gap you can because you don't want to fall off the cliff if you can help it. So the question becomes, with this leap of faith, is it more reasonable to make the leap that God does exist? Is that a shorter leap? Or to make the leap that God doesn't exist? Is that a shorter leap? Both sides, the theist and the atheist, have to make a leap of some sort. There's a leap of faith involved. You either have to decide that you do believe in God or you don't believe in God, but either way, you can't prove it. So everybody has to have some kind of faith in something, right? I have faith there is a God. I have faith that there isn't a God. Either way, you've got to have faith in one or the other. So Kierkegaard says you've got to take that leap of faith and move toward God, and only then can you find meaning and purpose, right? Now, piggybacking off of that, another useful thinker here, piggybacking off this leap of faith thing, is the writer Tolstoy. And Tolstoy said that he explored philosophy and he explored science, and he found that he couldn't get answers to the meaning and purpose of life in those two fields of study, right? So he finally looks around. He's like, I've searched for meaning and purpose. There is no meaning and purpose in philosophy, that you don't find meaning and purpose in science. So thinking back to what Nietzsche said about the arts and nobility, he's going to say no, no such thing, no purpose there. Thinking back to Camus and integrity, no purpose there. He says there's no purpose. That all of this stuff, and that's a technical term in philosophy, all of the physical stuff that makes up the universe, within all of this, there is no purpose, there is no meaning, there is no value. And so Tolstoy said he lived there for a very, very long time in that world of philosophy and science. And he said, there is no such thing as perfect. He found this to be overwhelming. And then he said this is a quote from him. This is really good. Quote, one can only live while one is intoxicated with life. As soon as one is sober, it is impossible not to see that it is all a mere fraud and a stupid fraud. That is precisely what it is. There is nothing either amusing or witty about it. It is simply cruel and stupid. So, what he's saying there is that you can feel like that in some moments in your life, perhaps a moment of great happiness or a moment of great achievement, you meet some goal that you've been trying to accomplish. Say you get your college degree, right? And you think that so much, you're working so hard towards reaching that goal. Only for a few moments, once you've met that goal, will you find some type of meaning or purpose in that. But very soon after that, you're going to be sobered by life. Now, think of it this way: if you've ever consumed alcohol in excess, the drunk does not last. You sober after a time. Or think of it this way: if you, I had a particularly happy childhood, and Christmas was always a big deal. We were poor, but Mom always really, made Christmas kind of special. And so there was a lot of Christmas magic for us. We'd get up really early and run in there, and there's all these presents, and it was a tremendous experience for me as a child. So, how long did that type of magic last? Once all the presents are open, and by the time you move to starting to put them away, the magic of the moment has disappeared. And that's what Tolstoy means. You can only live in life when you're intoxicated with that kind of happiness or achievement or whatever, but in time it will also fade. And once it fades, you're back to meaninglessness, purposelessness, nothing. And you begin to see life, all of life, in that way. And so he says that meaning and purpose, it's all a fraud. It's a stupid fraud. And so for him, because he lived there for so long, he lived in that particular view for so long, he came to four conclusions. There'll be a fifth one, but he came to four conclusions initially about how you should approach life, or how you could approach life. He didn't say which one you should choose. He thought he knew which one he should have chosen. But he says, since that's the case, since there's no God and there's no meaning and there's no purpose, you can't find it in science, you can't find it in philosophy, there's no meaning, there's no purpose. Here's your four options for what to do with your life. Again, interesting, useful. I think this will speak to you. It usually speaks to my students, right? Okay. He said the first of the ways is ignorance. And in this case, he says this is either the willful refusal or simply perhaps the inability for a person to realize that life really is absurd. And if you've ever seen those people who just are kind of happy, jerks, but they're just kind of happy and they don't seem to see, they don't seem to realize how bad life is or can be, or they refuse to see it on purpose, or they simply can't see it because it doesn't seem to be part of their mental makeup and the way they understand and see the world around them. Now, I'm the opposite. I tend to see the world as being pretty dark and overbearing. I do see a lot of joy, but I also see a lot of the difficulty that humans face. And so these people simply don't see it, whether it's by their own choice or not. They simply don't see it. So that's one way Tolstoy says you can go through your life. You can go through it and simply refuse to see, if you so choose, refuse to see that life is in fact a cosmic joke. The second way to approach life, if there's no meaning, then he says, is to maximize pleasure. And so here we see these individuals who say, all right, there's no meaning, there's no purpose, there's none. Hey, let's just go out and have as much fun as we can before we die. And so you go out and you maximize pleasure, right? Don't think I have to explain that one very much. Most of us understand it. This third way you'll need to pay attention to a little bit here, because it's going to probably be a little confusing at first because it seems backward, but you'll begin to see why he says what he says once we get to the fourth way. But pay close attention here on the third, right? This third one he calls the noble way, the way of strength and the way of energy. And here he says that since there's no meaning and there's no purpose, and since life does contain so much tragedy, um, and since it does contain so much hardship, that the right way, the right thing to do is to commit suicide. If you are truly strong, if you are truly someone who has great will and great willpower, then you will commit suicide. And he said, a rope around one's neck, water meaning to drown yourself, a knife into one's heart, or a train on the railroad tracks. Like lay down on the railroad tracks and let the train kill you. If you're really strong, that's what you would do. And so his fourth way then is what he calls the way of weakness. And he said this fourth way was where he lived for a very, very long time, um, because in the fourth way you see that life is ridiculous and it's absurd and it's full of hardship, but you don't have the strength to commit suicide. And that's what he said he was. He saw the absurdity, but he just didn't have the power. He just didn't have the ability to end that game. So that's his way of strength and energy. That's his fourth way of weakness. Now, eventually, he does come to a fifth way, and this is the conclusion he himself adopts. Here he says, the fifth way is a response to God in faith. And remember that leap of faith there with Kierkegaard. So you can respond to God and say, you know what? I'm going to find meaning and purpose in the fact of that there is a deity, right? And that deity created us for some meaning and purpose. And therefore, since our Creator designed us and designed this universe with purpose and with meaning, then there truly is purpose and meaning. And therefore, you go on a search for that purpose and meaning, looking for God and looking for God's purpose and meaning. So, Tolstoy said, I should have long ago killed myself had I not had a dim hope of finding him. I live, really live, only when I feel him and seek him. Right? So his purpose and meaning comes through his religious understanding. He was Christian, Russian Orthodox Christian. He had some squabbles there with his church, but he was Christian in this particular case. And so that's where he found meaning and purpose. So the answer is yeah. I mean, religion can offer hope and purpose and meaning for some individuals, in this case, certainly with Tolstoy. Okay, stuff for you to think about. Maybe you're one of those 5 ways there that I've described, Tolstoy's 5 ways. Most of the time, what my students find is that they tend to be a blend of a couple of them, usually two, sometimes three of those particular ways. They're a blend. You know, that you're not 100% one or two. Maybe you're a blend of one and two or something like that, right? So, something to think about. All right, now I told you we were going to talk a little bit about religious experiences, a little bit about personal experiences. I'm not going to go into any detail about my experience. That's not what we're trying to do here. What I want to do is just try and get you thinking about uh, perhaps your religious experiences or others. Maybe you're someone who's never had one. So it can be easy for people who have never had a religious experience to declare Tolstoy's experience as something that he made up in his own mind. And I think that that is certainly easy to do. And in fact, I think it's true that a lot of the religious experiences of people out there are things that they have made up in their own mind. It's something that they want. And so they decide that God's telling them that that's something that they should have. And here, have in mind one individual who said that they were going to marry me because God told them that, had revealed to them that was the case, and I didn't marry them. And so, either God lied, which we've already discussed, but, you know, sometimes people just make things up in their own mind and they decide that somehow it was God or whatever other religious thing. That's certainly true. So we want to be careful. We know those things exist within religious experiences. So, but, right? So it can be easy for people to declare that that's just something Tolstoy made up in his own mind. That may be true, but consider that assessing statements of religious experience such as this. If you've never had a religious experience, that can be a difficult thing to do. And here's what I mean. If you declare um, all religious experiences to be false because you've never had a religious experience, then you're making an illogical conclusion. And let me give you a different example and probably help you kind of see what I'm talking about here. Imagine that you've never fallen in love. Maybe you haven't. But imagine that you haven't, whether you have or haven't. Imagine you've never fallen in love, and then you turn around and you declare, and therefore, love doesn't exist. Well, what about all those individuals who have in fact fallen in love? Well, they've had an experience where that is something that has happened to them. And to discount the idea of love altogether simply because you have never experienced it is a mistake. It's a misstep in logic. And also, too, be careful with your religious experiences or the lack of religious experiences and how you use them, right? So be kind of careful here with this regard. Back to falling in love. Imagine that you sit down and you're trying to describe to someone who has never fallen in love what it's like to fall in love or what it's like to be in love. You can describe it, and perhaps if you're better at it than I am, very eloquently, you can put it into meaning. You can truly describe and give them a wonderful picture there in the package of words and explanation. Will they then know what it's like to fall in love? No, absolutely not. No. They still won't know until that happens to an individual. You can't really fully adequately explain to them in such a way that, oh, well, now I get it, even though I've never. It is such an interpersonal experience that it has to happen to you before you can really grasp what that is like. So I think uh, we can talk about personal experiences, but don't be surprised if it doesn't convince someone who doesn't believe in God that there is one, because it's something that they themselves have not had. On the other hand, you shouldn't be unconvinced, or you shouldn't disbelieve in God because you've never had a religious experience. That's a mistake as well. So you have to be careful with that stuff. those personal experiences are just that. They're personal, and they should help you and guide you. But helping and guiding others is something else. Okay. All right. So, last little piece here. Um, as we're looking at these religions, it's going to be very, very important that you don't treat them as alien or foreign or dangerous. Um, maybe some of them are, but that's not, you know, well, some of them are going to be alien and foreign to you, but also that dangerous part, maybe some of them are. But here's the really, really important aspect of this: we're coming to this class to understand the religion, not to decide if the religion is good or bad. That's a job for another class, right? It's not what we're trying to do in a classroom where we're studying these religions. We're not analyzing them to see if any of them are true, false, good, evil. That's not what we're after here, right? So we want to be really, really careful as we approach these things. Keep it in your mind that education begins with information, and until you understand these religions, you shouldn't declare them as true, false, good, evil, any of those things. We start with understanding. That's why this class is a foundational, basic class. And if you are so interested, then later you can begin to study and try to figure out which one you think is true or false. That's a step that certainly can be taken at a later date, but that's not what we're after. Okay? All right. So, all of that in introduction to world religions. Hopefully, that got some of the ball turning. You're going to start thinking about these different things as we move forward through the course. And so, I will see you next time.